Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon's Marshals Part 3 by Epic History TV. So I noticed getting to this part that as we get further in the series, we cover fewer marshals per episode, so we're getting more detail as we get closer to the top of the group. And at this point, we've reached the very middle, so now we're getting to the top 50% of Napoleon's marshals, which is pretty exciting. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
Terror belli, decus pacis. Terror in war, ornament in peace.
What a great intro.
The words inscribed on every French marshal's baton. In France, the title of Marshal or Maréchal goes back at least to the 13th century. It represents the highest possible position of military authority, authority symbolized by a marshal's baton. The title was abolished during the French Revolution as incompatible with the egalitarian spirit of the age. But in 1804, Napoleon founded a new empire and restored the ancient rank. This is Epic History TV's guide to Napoleon's marshals.
You know, just a note, I actually like how the position of marshal itself kind of plays into one of the topics we've been covering so far in these videos, which is Napoleon's relationship to the revolution, because a lot of these marshals played some sort of role in the revolution. And so we've been talking about how Napoleon was both, in some ways, a continuation of the revolution and also a massive break. And so, obviously, the position of marshal is relevant because it was abolished during the revolution and then brought back by Napoleon. So it's sort of part of that split between the revolutionary period and the rule of Napoleon. So I think it's interesting how, the marshal's baton and the position itself is part of this trend.
All 26 have been ranked according to our own evaluation of their achievements as marshals, with expert guidance from Lieutenant Colonel Rémy Porte, former chief historian of the French Army.
Whoa.
So far, we've met Marshals Pérignon, Brune, Serrurier, Kellerman, Grouchy, Moncey, Poniatowski, Jourdan, Bernadotte, Augereau, Lefebvre, Mortier, and Marmont.
And of this group, these are technically the bottom 50%, but a lot of these guys are pretty respectable in many ways, and the reason they sit near the back was often just because they weren't as active as other marshals. Maybe they were political picks, they didn't serve that much. Really, there were a few who were put there perhaps because of, bad decisions they made, but mostly it's a pretty talented, respectable bunch, which I suppose should tell you something about this group of men that we're looking at. Even the worst of the worst are still pretty impressive.
First, a big
Alright, you guys know the deal. I've got Epic History TV's video linked down below, so you should go check out that link, give them a like, go check out their sponsor, which they will have linked in the description of their video. Basically, go show them some love, some support for making such fantastic videos.
You can cancel at any time. Thanks again to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. 13. Marshal Saint-Cyr.
Saint-Cyr, okay.
Gouvion Saint-Cyr was a gifted student who ran away from a miserable childhood to become an artist.
Once again, a quick note. Background, son of a butcher, middle-class background. Another one of these guys who had a sort of middle-class bourgeois background who was able to rise to the top during the Revolution and under Napoleon.
A passionate Republican, he embraced the French Revolution and later volunteered for military service. Though proud and aloof by nature, His Republican politics and sharp intellect ensured he was elected captain of his company. His skill at drawing enemy positions then got him noticed by General Custine, who gave him a job on his staff.
Nice.
During these turbulent early years of the revolution, Custine was one of several generals who was punished for defeat with a trip to the guillotine.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, during the revolution, particularly during the Reign of Terror, generals and military leaders that faced defeat in the field would not just be reprimanded or demoted or removed from their position, but would often be executed, killed for, a failure. That failure in battle was seen as a betrayal of the revolution. They weren't passionate enough. They didn't believe in the revolution. Maybe they were a traitor. And during this very hyperbolic time, that would lead to a lot of executions. So that's the sort of environment we're talking about in that, 1793-4 era. Very radical.
Saint-Cyr's instinctive grasp of warfare, brilliant planning and tactics won him promotion from volunteer to general of division in 2 years.
Nice.
An even more remarkable achievement, as he'd had no formal military training.
Intelligent
His
guy.
cold, analytical approach meant that he was always a respected leader, rather than loved. After 5 years' service with the Army of the Rhine, he was sent to Italy. At the disastrous Battle of Novi, he commanded the French right wing, but skillfully extricated his troops from the debacle.
So, seems like he was a very skillful, intelligent guy, but he didn't necessarily have the love of his men. And that's sort of, if you're talking about being a leader, let's say a military leader in particular, you can have that analytical skill, and that's really important. But, that being able to, boost the morale of your men and inspire them, that's also important. So these are, two important elements, and not everybody in these high positions of command has both. You might have one or the other, or more of one than the other, or you might have neither, in which case you may not be suited for your role. So that's sort of an interesting note about Saint-Cyr's personality, I guess.
The next year he was back on the Rhine and won a brilliant victory over the Austrians at Biberach. But a bitter dispute with his commander, General Murat, encouraged rumours that Saint-Cyr was impossible to work with. Saint-Cyr believed soldiers should not meddle in politics, and did not support Napoleon's seizure of power in 1799. Nor did he show much enthusiasm for Napoleon's decision to crown himself emperor 5 years later.
Interesting.
His political views cost him dearly. Saint-Cyr was sidelined for several years, while less able generals were made marshals. In 1805, he commanded French forces in central Italy. But when he was made subordinate to Marshal Massena, a man whom he personally detested, he returned to Paris, even when Napoleon threatened to have him shot for desertion.
Okay, so that Saint-Cyr got to where he was purely through his skill and ability, because his personality and politics are not doing him any favors. They're bringing him down. They are preventing his promotion. So, he has made it this high, and he will, make it to the position of Marshal through exclusively his competence.
In 1808, Saint-Cyr was given command of a corps for the invasion of Spain, but his failure to take Girona meant he was relieved of command. Leaving in a fury before his replacement, Marshal Oudinot, had arrived, he was nearly court-martialed again for desertion. Saint-Cyr's military talent, however, was not in doubt. In 1812, he was recalled for the Russia campaign, with command of 6th Bavarian Corps. His role was to support Marshal Oudinot in guarding the northern flank of the French salient. When Wittgenstein's Russians attacked at Polotsk, Oudinot was wounded, and Saint-Cyr took over command, turning probable defeat into a brilliant victory. For this achievement, Napoleon awarded Saint-Cyr his Marshal's baton.
Finally.
But 2 months later, at a second Battle of Polotsk, Saint-Cyr was attacked by a larger Russian army, seriously wounded in the foot and forced to pull back. His injury meant he missed the worst horrors of the Russian retreat, but he contracted typhus early in 1813 and was sick for many months. Saint-Cyr returned to the Grande Armée in August, taking command of 14th Corps and the defense of Dresden. Incredibly, this was the first and only time that he worked directly alongside the Emperor.
I was gonna say, it's kind of a shame he wasn't made a marshal earlier, and we know why. It was because of his politics and his struggle to get along with other military leaders. But, you know, we probably could have seen his talent shine even more if he had been made a marshal, say, back in 1804. Think of all the opportunities he would have been granted. Instead, he's gotten... I mean, you know, he's been around this whole time, but he's only gotten to this high position of military leadership, you know, really late on.
And both soon learned new respect for each other's abilities.
Okay.
Saint-Cyr's skilled defense of Dresden set the stage for Napoleon's great victory there later that month. But Saint-Cyr was incredulous when Napoleon later ordered him to remain in Dresden, while other forces concentrated for the decisive Battle of Leipzig, 60 miles to the west. Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig meant that Saint-Cyr and other garrisons in the east were cut off and had to surrender that autumn.
That's unfortunate.
Saint-Cyr took no part in the 100 Days.
Kind of an ignoble end for Saint-Cyr. You know, he was one of those men who was trapped in the east when Napoleon really had little choice but to leave them behind.
Determined to keep out of France's political disputes.
Fair.
Under the restored monarchy, he served as Minister of War and tried, but failed, to save Marshal Ney from the death penalty.
Interesting.
He also struggled to enact military reforms in the face of royalist opposition.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little interesting that he would join the royal court, given his republicanism, but, you know, it did seem like he was a man who, you know, wanted to get things done. It makes sense that he would be a reformer. Seems like he was a pretty rational, intelligent guy, but, of course, reform, you know, under the royal authority would be quite difficult.
Eventually resigning in disgust and retiring to his country estate. Marshal Saint-Cyr remains one of the great what-ifs of the Napoleonic Wars. An extremely able commander sidelined for his politics, who might well have proved one of Napoleon's very best marshals.
I mean, that's exactly what I said earlier. You know, think of what he could have accomplished if he had been made a marshal 10 years earlier. Seems like a guy who had a lot of potential, and maybe if he'd been given the position, it wouldn't have played out, but there also seems a pretty strong chance they would have accomplished great things, but we'll never know.
12. Marshal Oudinot.
Interesting quote.
Nicolas Oudinot ran away to join the army aged 17, but his father dragged him home 3 years later to help run the family business. When the revolution began, he volunteered for the National Guard and was promoted to major.
Another middle-class fellow who got into the military during the early days of the revolution. You know, familiar archetype amongst this group.
In the wars that followed, he served with the Army of the Rhine, always in the thick of the fighting, rapidly promoted and frequently wounded, a habit for which he became celebrated. In 1799, he was promoted to General of Division and sent to Switzerland to serve as General Massena's new Chief of Staff, a role he performed to perfection. Serving with General Brune in Italy, he led a cavalry charge against an Austrian battery at the Battle of Monzembano, sabering gunners and capturing one cannon himself, a feat for which Napoleon awarded him a Sword of Honor. In 1805, the newly crowned Emperor Napoleon gave Oudinot command of an elite grenadier division formed from the tallest, strongest soldiers in the army. In December that year, at the Battle of Austerlitz, Oudinot insisted on leading the division in person.
Yeah, that is unsurprising. He seems like a brave, daring leader who always wants to be on the front lines himself. You know, he wants to be the first one over the line, the first one to fight, and seemingly the first one to get wounded often. But that's a testament to his bravery, I suppose.
Despite having been shot in the thigh 2 weeks earlier.
Wow.
His grenadiers were kept in reserve for most of the battle, but saw heavy fighting in the latter stages, as Napoleon completed the destruction of the Allied left wing. At the Siege of Danzig in 1807, General Oudinot's division had the unusual distinction of capturing an enemy warship,
Rare.
a British sloop, that had run aground trying to resupply the city.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the French capturing a British warship? How on earth could that have happened? Well, it ran aground. Obviously, the French were no match for the Brits, in the open water. But, given an opportunity like that, I'm sure that was a big morale-boosting event to capture a British ship.
A month later, at Friedland, Oudinot and his grenadiers were under Marshal Lannes's command and played a crucial role holding up the Russian army, until Napoleon arrived to deal a decisive blow. During the 1809 war with Austria, Oudinot was wounded once more at the Battle of Aspern.
Of course.
When Marshal Lannes died of his wounds, Napoleon chose Oudinot to succeed him as commander of 2nd Corps.
It's interesting because, not to say that Oudinot and Saint-Cyr were necessarily opposites, but, Saint-Cyr sort of represented the more behind-the-lines, tactical, strategic mind. Not to say he wasn't brave or anything, but, he was very cold, calculating, whereas, Oudinot very much represents the, charge ahead, personally lead my men, get in there and fight sort of attitude. So, like I was saying, not to say the two men are opposites or that one was brave and the other was not. That's not what I'm saying, but I do think they sort of represent two different attitudes towards the job, to put it that way.
He led his new corps with such success at Wagram 6 weeks later that Napoleon attributed victory to Massena and Oudinot.
Nice.
A week later, he became one of 3 new marshals. One for France, one for the army, one for friendship.
Yeah, I remember we saw those quotes before, and it makes a little more sense. I'm sure, Oudinot was well-liked and well-respected for his bravery and his willingness to put himself on the line, so that, Oudinot made a marshal for the army. That makes a lot of sense.
Oudinot, the army's choice, fearless and much loved, a man
Right.
whose courage inspired all around him. He later
Nice.
received an additional reward, the title Duke of Reggio. In 1812, Marshal Oudinot led 2nd Corps into Russia, but was wounded again at Polotsk and handed over command to General Saint-Cyr.
I mean, I will say, much respect for his bravery and daring, and, him being frequently wounded was one of the things that made him so loved, and, not saying that's a bad thing, but when you're in such an important position, being wounded can be a big detriment if it takes you out of the battle. When you're a marshal, you're needed. And so if you keep getting wounded, that could become a problem eventually if you keep having to be removed. Though I will say he seems to recover pretty quickly, so maybe it wasn't that much of an issue for Oudinot.
10 weeks later, he was back with his corps, marching south to join up with Napoleon's army on its retreat from Moscow. Oudinot's men were shocked when they saw their old comrades from the main column. They looked more like fugitives than soldiers of the Grande Armée.
Yeah.
Since Oudinot's 2nd Corps was in better shape than most, it formed the vanguard for the desperate crossing of the Berezina River. But the next day, in bitter fighting to hold the bridgehead against the Russians, Oudinot was shot from his saddle. He was carried back to a cottage with a serious gunshot wound. But then he and his party became surrounded by Cossacks. Oudinot asked for his pistols, and from his bed, aiming through an opening opposite, began firing at the Cossacks.
You know, when they said he asked for his pistols, and I know this wasn't the case because I can see his death date, for a second I thought, man, maybe he's going to kill himself rather than be taken alive, but not the right guy. This is Oudinot, so of course, doesn't matter how injured he is, how incapacitated he is, he wants his gun so he can keep fighting. Yeah, you really get a good idea of the personalities of each marshal through this series. I think that's one of the great parts about this series, and, you know, this is just seemingly very typical of Oudinot. You know, this is exactly the decision you would expect him to make.
They were rescued by friendly troops, just in time.
Wow.
Oudinot was back with the Grande Armée in Germany in 1813. In August, Napoleon ordered him to lead an advance on Berlin, but he was defeated by Bernadotte's Army of the North at Grossbeeren. He then retreated in the wrong direction, causing Napoleon to remark, "It's truly difficult to have less brains than the Duke of Reggio."
Yeah, that's tough.
In Oudinot's defense, he'd probably been given an impossible task. Insufficient men to take on a strong opponent, bad weather, terrible roads, and he himself unwell, possibly not yet recovered from his ordeal in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, both of Napoleon's quotes about Oudinot that we've seen so far have basically been Napoleon saying that he's an idiot. But, I mean, you know, I feel like he can't have been that much of an idiot given all his accomplishments. You know, maybe, I'm sure he wasn't the brightest amongst the marshals, but, you know, I think Napoleon may be a little harsh in his criticism.
Napoleon put Oudinot back where he was most effective, leading troops in combat under his close supervision.
Exactly.
At Leipzig, he commanded 2 divisions of the Young Guard, engaged in heavy fighting on the southern front for 2 days. Oudinot continued to serve the Emperor courageously and loyally as a corps commander in the final campaign of 1814. But in April, he was one of several marshals to confront Napoleon with the reality of his position and force his abdication. When Napoleon returned from exile in 1815, Oudinot refused to break his new oath to the monarchy, but declared neutrality, telling Napoleon, "Since I shall not serve you, sire, I shall serve no one."
I mean, hey, that, you know, him confronting Napoleon and doing this when Napoleon returns, you know, from his records, you might think Oudinot's kind of loyal dog, basically, and from Napoleon's comments about his intelligence, but, you know, it's clear Oudinot could think for himself, and, you know, he wasn't that stupid, you know, he could think about the situation he was in, and I think, you know, we can see that from what he did, you know, in the end.
He continued to hold senior commands under the Bourbons. By one estimate, Oudinot was wounded 36 times in his military career.
Wow.
More than any other marshal. Here are just 20 that we found details for.
That's
fellow
remarkable.
officer who bathed with him at a spa after the war saw the scars on his body and observed he was little more than a colander. Ironically, Oudinot was also one of the longest-lived marshals.
Yeah, I noticed that from his death date. You know, this was a man who was getting injured all the time, and his body was covered in scars and gunshot wounds and, you know, other damage. And yet, he lived until the age of 80, a long, successful life. How about that?
Dying aged 80 while serving as governor of Les Invalides. 11. Marshal Victor.
Okay.
Claude Victor Perrin was an experienced soldier by the time of the French Revolution. A sergeant with 8 years' service in the Grenoble artillery regiment. The Revolutionary Wars brought the opportunity for rapid promotion, and by 1793, he was commanding an infantry battalion.
Another sort of son of a bailiff, sort of maybe upper middle class fellow who found a lot of opportunity during the revolution.
At the siege of Toulon.
Ah.
He led a daring night assault on British defences, alongside the army's artillery chief, a young Major Bonaparte. Both men were wounded, but the attack was a success, and both were quickly promoted to Brigadier General.
Another one who was there from the beginning.
Victor served under General Bonaparte in Italy, and turned out to be a brilliant brigade commander. In 1800, he distinguished himself at the Battle of Marengo, where his command of the left wing won particular praise from Napoleon. But Victor did not hide his disapproval of Napoleon's quest for political power, and as a result, received relatively minor roles under the new regime.
Oh, there you go. We can see, and we saw this with Saint-Cyr as well, we can see Napoleon's regard for politics, you know? And we talked about this before, but Napoleon was not just a military leader, he was a political leader. And he was a good one, at least in terms of gaining power and holding it. And also, you know, he was pretty talented at actually governing the country he had taken over. But, you know, we can see that Napoleon, like many of the revolutionaries a few years ago, not only did he need competent men by his side, but he needed them to be loyal to him and loyal to his cause. And so, you know, he has some competent figures that he could bring up to the top with him, but if they have reservations, particularly for political reasons, maybe they're Republicans who are unwilling to shift to his cause, then he's going to have to keep them at a distance, at least until they sort of come around, which many of them do sooner or later.
In 1802, he was earmarked to lead an expedition to recover the French territory of Louisiana.
Really?
But it was called off when Napoleon decided instead to sell Louisiana to the United States.
Obviously, I'm familiar with the Louisiana Purchase. I did not know that there was a plan to recover the territory. Yeah, I didn't know that was part of it. Obviously, I'm familiar that it was sold to the United States. I just kind of thought, well, I'm sure Napoleon didn't have time to think about, you know, his territory in North America. He just probably wanted to get it off his hands so he could deal with his affairs in Europe. But apparently there was a plan to take it back, though I'm not sure how seriously it was considered before Napoleon ended up selling the territory.
Victor and Marshal Lannes were close friends from their days serving together in Italy. In 1806, Lannes persuaded Napoleon to let him have Victor as his new chief of staff for 5th Corps.
Okay.
Napoleon agreed, and in October, Victor served as Lannes' deputy at the Battle of Jena.
Helping the homies out, I respect that.
Napoleon's earlier misgivings about Victor were now forgotten, and that winter he was given command of the newly formed 10th Corps. But within weeks, he was captured by a Prussian patrol and had to be exchanged for a captured Prussian officer.
It's unfortunate.
General von Blücher.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal.
His big break came in 1807, stepping in for the wounded Marshal Bernadotte to command 1st Corps at Friedland, where he successfully led a major attack as the Emperor looked on. Promotion to Marshal and the title Duke of Bellumo swiftly followed. In 1808, Marshal Victor and 1st Corps took part in the invasion of Spain, where he'd be posted for the next 3 years.
Ooh.
Victor's record in Spain was better than most, but like others, he seemed more interested in personal glory and rewards than in cooperating with fellow commanders.
Yeah, I mean, being stationed in Spain, that's a tough assignment. Not to mention that, unfortunately, a lot of the men stationed there were more interested in looking out for themselves and looting rather than conducting an effective French strategy to defend their territory. Though, you know, like I said, the position was difficult in the first place. The French were overstretched. So it would have been difficult no matter how devoted he was. But, you know, a lot of the men there were not so devoted, at least at that moment.
In 1809 at Medellin, he inflicted a crushing defeat on General Cuesta's Spanish army. 4 months later, his bold night attack on the British at Talavera came tantalizingly close to success.
Ooh.
He was furious the next day when King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan refused to support fresh attacks and instead ordered a cautious withdrawal. The next year, Victor besieged the Spanish port of Cadiz. It proved a lengthy, futile operation.
I mean, it seems like Victor was attempting a lot of different things, with perhaps some mixed success, but with some successes and, you know, coming very close to some major successes in Spain.
Void of glory, and saw his troops defeated by an allied sortie at the Battle of Barossa.
Yeah, that's rough, though.
In 1812, Victor was recalled from Spain for the invasion of Russia. His 9th Corps was held in reserve for most of the campaign, though his...
You know, it's interesting, and we talked about this during the original Napoleonic War series by Epic History TV, how, you know, a lot of troops were taken from Spain to Russia, though a lot were left behind, and there was the question of, you know, to what extent did that influence things? You know, would the campaign in Russia have been more successful if more men were taken from Spain? You know, I think not. But, you know, we can also see in this series that a lot of talented military leaders were taken from Spain and sent to Russia. Now, both Spain and Russia were bad situations for the French, but you do have to wonder what would have happened if, you know, Spain could exclusively have been focused on, because, you know, the Russian campaign was basically hopeless, but, you know, if Napoleon could have focused his own efforts and the efforts of his most talented men on Spain, he would have had a way better chance, and he definitely would have been able to at least repel the British from all the successes they saw in Spain.
His troops were kept busy defending depots and convoys from Cossack raids. That autumn, his corps attempted to cover the main army's retreat from Moscow. The greatest crisis of the retreat came at the Berezina River. As the remnants of the Grande Armée began crossing over 2 improvised bridges, Victor's 9th Corps was ordered to form the rearguard.
Right.
Though heavily outnumbered, Victor skillfully handled his French and German troops, holding the Russians at bay as the army made its escape. He then marched his surviving troops over the bridges in good order. A courageous performance in desperate circumstances.
Yeah, seems like he was a talented guy. You know, intelligent, brave, level-headed, a lot to respect there.
In Germany in 1813, Victor commanded 2nd Corps and led the attack in Napoleon's last great victory at Dresden. His corps was in heavy fighting again at Leipzig 2 months later. Victor continued to serve at the Emperor's side in the defense of France in 1814. By now, like many comrades, he must have been close to physical and psychological exhaustion. Regardless, during the Battle of Montereau, Napoleon let fly at him for failing to get his troops into position and blamed him for the Allies' escape.
That's
Victor
rough.
was relieved of command, but angry and humiliated at what he considered his unfair dismissal, he told the Emperor, "Marshal Victor has not forgotten his old trade. I will shoulder a musket and take my place in the guard." Moved by this response, Napoleon relented and gave Victor command of a corps of young guard.
Okay.
2 weeks later, he was badly wounded at the Battle of Craon and took no further part in the war.
That's a tough way to end things, but, you know, his career is pretty commendable overall.
A month later, Napoleon abdicated, and Victor switched his loyalty to the Bourbon monarchy with surprising zeal.
Really?
He led an investigation into former comrades who'd supported Napoleon during the 100 Days, and was one of only 2 active marshals to vote for the death penalty for Marshal Ney.
I wonder why. You know, we've seen other marshals that turned against Napoleon, but usually there was some pretty obvious personal or political animosity there. I wonder what drove Victor to go to the Bourbon regime with such energy and turn against his old allies with such enthusiasm. You know, that, considering how well and loyally he served, that seems kind of out of nowhere. I mean, I'm not surprised that a lot of the men would serve the next regime. You know, they're soldiers, they're military men, they want to do their job regardless of who's in power politically, but to be so harsh, for example, against your former comrades, that is interesting, and I do wonder where that feeling originated from.
A decision he later claimed to regret. Victor later served as Minister of War, but retired from public life in 1830, following the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy.
Murat.
Marshal Murat.
Another very familiar name.
Joachim Murat, the son of an innkeeper, was destined for a career in the church, but dropped out of college and joined a cavalry regiment instead.
Yep, another middle-class guy. A career in the church, by the way, was fairly common for sort of middle-class young men who perhaps they weren't the firstborn and weren't going to inherit the family business, or perhaps they didn't have many opportunities. The church was a good opportunity for men like that. They could go and be educated, live a pretty respectable lifestyle in a respectable role. So the church was a pretty common career path for middle-class fellas like Murat. Though, of course, the military would be another alternative, and that's what he went for in the end.
To his immense frustration, he saw little action in the early years of the Revolutionary Wars, being stuck with staff and training roles. But in 1795, while stationed in Paris with the 21st Chasseurs, fate intervened. A young general, Napoleon Bonaparte, had been put in charge of the defense of the National Convention. With a mob poised to storm the building, he ordered Captain Murat to bring him cannons, which he did, racing the guns through the city streets, allowing Napoleon to mow down the mob with a famous whiff of grape shot.
Yep. I mean, I'm sure Murat being a part of that would have really boosted his opportunities and his reputation, because, as I'm sure many of you know, Napoleon defeating these royalists in Paris was a massive boost to his reputation. Made him a lot more well-known than he was, and really got him on the side of the government, who would turn to him for future jobs. So this was a really big moment in Napoleon's career, and seems like it's going to be a big moment in Murat's career as well.
Napoleon was hailed as the savior of the government and rewarded with command of the army of Italy. Murat was promoted colonel and went with him as his new aide-de-camp. He soon made a name for himself as a bold and brilliant leader of cavalry. While his 6-foot height, curly locks, and love of women ensured fame as France's foremost beau seigneur.
A very romantic figure.
In 1798, Murat joined Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. At the Battle of Aboukir, his flanking charge broke the enemy, and Murat personally took the Ottoman commander prisoner, despite being shot in the jaw, a wound which, to his immense relief, did not ruin his looks. Back in Paris, Napoleon launched his coup d'etat to seize political power. When he got a hostile reception from the Council of 500, it was Murat who saved the day.
Okay, so, I mean, from the other series, Murat was a very important marshal, high up there, trusted by Napoleon, and we're seeing why in his background. He really rose alongside Napoleon and was with him at, so far, some of the most important events in Napoleon's life, and was there to help out or save the day in this instance.
Leading troops in to clear the chamber, shouting, "Citizens, you have been dissolved," before adding something a bit more coarse.
Nice.
His place at the future emperor's side was further assured when he married Napoleon's youngest sister, Caroline, in 1800. Later that year, he commanded the French cavalry reserve at Marengo and helped Napoleon to win a decisive victory over the Austrians. When Napoleon established his empire in 1804, Murat became a marshal, second in seniority only to Berthier. He'd later also received the title Prince of the Empire and the rank of Grand Admiral. In the 1805 campaign, he commanded Napoleon's cavalry reserve, his excellent reconnaissance and diversions proving crucial in the encirclement of General Mack's Austrian army at Ulm.
Yeah.
3 weeks later, Murat and Marshal Lannes, who normally couldn't stand each other, together bluffed an Austrian commander into surrendering a vital bridge by persuading him that an armistice had been signed when it hadn't.
Smart guy, and as we saw in the series on the Napoleonic Wars, just a daring, brave commander. Always willing to get in there and fight, but he knew how to do it intelligently. So yeah.
It was a bold stunt, but overall Napoleon was not impressed by Murat's pursuit of the enemy.
Really?
I cannot approve your manner of march. You go on like a stunned fool, taking not the least notice of my orders. Yet in battle, Murat remained a brilliant and inspiring leader, as demonstrated at Austerlitz, and the next year at Jena.
It does kind of seem like Murat liked to do things his own way, which I'm sure was frustrating to Napoleon, though Murat was someone who was talented enough to do things his own way, I mean, you do want men who can strike out on their own and be successful. Of course, if something goes wrong, then that's a big problem for Napoleon. And, of course, you don't want men that aren't capable trying to do their own thing. So I can see why he'd be frustrated. But Murat is seeing a lot of success.
Where he led the decisive charge, wielding only his riding crop.
Wow.
The next year, at Eylau, with the Russians poised to break through his center, Napoleon ordered Murat to lead a mass cavalry charge straight at the enemy. Murat's men succeeded and saved the army from disaster, though at a terrible price in men and horses. Napoleon had rewarded Murat in 1806 by making him sovereign prince of the Grand Duchy of Berg.
Nice.
In 1808, he sent Murat to Spain to act as his representative. Spain was still a French ally, but in May, Napoleon's heavy-handed meddling in Spanish affairs triggered a ferocious backlash. Madrid rose up against the French garrison, and Murat's troops fought back with brutal force, killing around 200, executing 300 more.
Jesus.
When Napoleon deposed Spain's Bourbon monarchy, Murat hoped he'd be made the new king of Spain. But that title went to Napoleon's brother, Joseph. Murat instead received the throne of Naples. If it felt like second prize, it wasn't bad going for an innkeeper's son, college dropout, and ex-cavalry trooper.
Yeah, I mean, really not a bad consolation prize. Once again, Murat is another one, like I mentioned earlier, of these middle-class guys who rose up through the Revolution and under Napoleon. And he was one of those who rose the highest, from just a regular middle-class guy who had joined the military to the King of Naples. That is, a rare rise to power. You do not see stuff like that often throughout history. It's very impressive, but under Napoleon, you saw a lot of stuff like that. I mean, Napoleon was taking his family members and his most trusted subordinates and plopping them into positions across Europe. You're Prince of here, you're King of here, you're Duke of here. So Napoleon was doing a lot of that, but, Murat is probably one of the better examples.
Napoleon expected Murat to merely represent his interests in Naples, but Murat had other ideas. He reformed the Neapolitan army, equipping it with splendid new uniforms, and turned a blind eye to smuggling, which undermined Napoleon's economic war against Britain.
Interesting. We saw Bernadotte with Sweden, but that was a different situation. He was selected by the Swedes, or, powerful Swedes, to go and rule their country, and Napoleon more signed off on it. And from the beginning, I think there was sort of an understanding that Bernadotte would first represent Sweden and its, own interests separate from France, whereas Murat was directly placed in his position by Napoleon. So, and this is how Napoleon worked, of course. The reason he was putting his subordinates and family members in positions across Europe was because he wanted to dominate all of Europe. And all these new states and kingdoms he was setting up or taking control of, this was one of the lies of the Revolution and Napoleon. They were French puppet states. There was no regard for the independence of other countries. So I'm sure there was an expectation that Murat would rule Naples in the interests of France and Napoleon. It seems like he was diverging from that a little bit.
The so-called continental system. Relations between Murat and the Emperor became strained. But when Napoleon began planning to invade Russia in 1812, only Murat would do to lead his cavalry. The differences were put to one side. Murat took command of 4 cavalry corps and became Napoleon's second in command. During the advance into Russia, Murat's cavalry faced a difficult and frustrating task, trying to locate the enemy in a vast landscape. Horses died in their thousands from poor fodder and exhaustion.
That's got to be tough because, cavalry was an extremely important tool for scouting, for example, but as we know from the campaign in Russia, most of the cavalry did not make it through that campaign. The horses would freeze, starve, die in the side of the road. It was tough for everybody, but, it would have been tough for the cavalry, especially because, you're no longer a cavalry if you've lost your mount.
And they faced a dangerous and wily opponent in Russia's Cossacks.
Right.
Murat, always riding with the advance guard, was so fearless and conspicuous in his extravagant uniforms that the Cossacks came to admire him, calling out, "Ura, Murat," whenever they saw him.
That's funny. That shows you the kind of guy that Murat was. We've seen he's talented, he's daring, he's brave, he does things his own way, whether it comes to how he rules his kingdom, how he leads his men, how he dresses. He's a pretty exotic figure, he's flamboyant. And I do think, from what I know about the Cossacks, they would respect someone who was so daring and so brave, because that's exactly what they were. They were daring, brave cavalrymen. And so, real recognize real, right? So that's sort of a funny note.
And hoped to capture him alive if possible. Murat was among those who tried to persuade Napoleon to halt the advance at Smolensk, but was ignored. At the great clash between the French and Russian armies at Borodino, Murat was at his best, directing a series of attacks on the Russian earthworks, always where the action was hottest, inspiring all with his courage. Murat remained with the army during the retreat from Moscow, though his magnificent cavalry had virtually ceased to exist.
Yeah. Obviously that was a low point for the entire Grande Armée. We know it was a low point for Napoleon. Also, was of course a low point for those around him. But think about the heights Napoleon had risen to, and then think about this desperate, brutal retreat from Russia. Must have been a similar thing for Murat. He'd risen from, almost nothing in this middle-class position to, one of the most trusted associates of Napoleon and the King of Naples. He was, grand, a splendid figure. And then think about the position he was in now. Must have been pretty desperate, pretty depressing for everybody, having to be, in this brutal retreat.
One eyewitness noted that throughout the ordeal, he never neglected his appearance.
Really?
Even at the Berezina, he looked splendid, in an open-necked shirt, velvet cloak, a white feather in his cap.
How about that? Well, hey, maybe Murat always kept some positivity with him, He always wanted to keep his persona up.
When Napoleon left the army to return to Paris, he gave command to Marshal Murat. But Murat, now primarily concerned with hanging on to his kingdom, left the army a month later and returned to Naples, where he opened secret negotiations with the coalition.
Yep.
He offered to join the war against Napoleon if the other powers would let him keep his crown. But he received only a lukewarm response. So in 1813, when Napoleon asked Murat to join him in Germany to fight for their thrones together, he answered the call.
Yep.
Murat had become increasingly difficult to work with, oversensitive about his royal status, prone to tantrums, but in battle as fearless as ever.
That's kind of the impression I was getting with the differences that were emerging with him and Napoleon. Seems like he was someone who rose from nothing to about the highest you could be, a king, and was someone who really wanted to hold on to that and really valued that. It feels like that's probably something that came to define him, was his position. Yet he keeps going back to Napoleon because, let's be honest, despite his talents, the other European powers probably are not interested in keeping him on the throne of Naples. He's way too much of a wild card. They would probably much rather have him gone. So he goes back to Napoleon. But despite the difficulties and, I'm sure he had a pretty inflated self-perception at this point, as we've seen, still a very talented soldier. He's still great at his job. He's still daring. He's still intelligent. So, Napoleon still feels like he wants to have him by his side.
At Dresden, his charge through rain and mud shattered the Austrian left wing and paved the way for victory. But then at Liebert-Volkwitz, he showed his limitations when not under Napoleon's direct command, getting drawn into a major and unnecessary cavalry battle with coalition forces.
Interesting.
Twice, nearly being captured himself. 2 days later, at the Battle of Leipzig, he led another of history's great cavalry charges, coming close to breaking the enemy's center and even capturing the Allied monarchs.
Wow.
But it was not to be.
So, Murat was extremely talented. Seems like he was someone who worked really well within a framework, right? So, Napoleon would give him some flexibility, and he would operate really well under those conditions. But given more freedom, he might struggle, seemingly. Maybe an overambitious guy would perhaps get into conflicts he didn't need to be in. So, someone who worked well with a bit of wiggle room, but not too much. And we can see that in his political life as well. Very ambitious, wanted to hold on to his positions, really valued that. But perhaps was more effective working under, the watch of Napoleon, who could hold him back if he was going a little too far.
Battle of the Nations ended in a disastrous defeat. As Napoleon retreated to the French frontier, Murat informed the emperor that he was leaving for Naples, promising to raise fresh troops. Murat and Napoleon would never meet again. 3 months later, the King of Naples had cut a deal with the coalition and switched sides.
Yep.
So long as it was possible for me to believe that the Emperor Napoleon was fighting to bring peace and glory to France, I fought loyally at his side, Murat declared. But now, I know that the Emperor's sole desire is war.
Yeah, I find that pretty hard to believe. I think Murat was just saying whatever would sound good, trying to justify his own involvement with Napoleon. From what we've seen, his decision was, I think, clearly more self-serving, right? he stuck with Napoleon until he was able to get a guarantee that he could keep his position. That's all he wanted. He wanted to maintain his position as King of Naples. He wanted to maintain the heights which he had reached. So, this idea that, well, I fought with Napoleon because I believed he was bringing peace and glory, but, now that I know that's not true, I can't stick by him. I really don't believe that. That's just a bit of PR, which is fine. I mean, all leaders do that, but I think we can pretty clearly see through that.
However, Murat's commitment to the Sixth Coalition was distinctly half-hearted.
Yup.
His army marched against Eugene's forces in northern Italy, but had done no actual fighting before news arrived of Napoleon's abdication.
Like I said earlier, Bernadotte is a good example of someone who he went to lead Sweden, he went to lead another country, and he really committed to it, He led Swedish forces faithfully against French forces, and then he ruled his country. Murat was always more on the edge, perhaps because of his loyalty to Napoleon, or because Napoleon put him there in the first place, but, he was closer to the middle.
Murat then began to suspect what had been obvious to Napoleon at least. The coalition was not going to honor its promise.
Of course.
Murat would be next to lose his throne.
He was too dangerous, too much of a wild card.
In 1815, encouraged by news of Napoleon's return from exile, Murat marched north against the Austrians, proclaiming a war for Italian freedom and independence.
I remember when we were watching that in the main series, if you look at the map, he's really the only ally that Napoleon has at this point. It's a Europe that has unified against Napoleon, again, to prevent him from gaining more power. And then his one ally, Murat and Naples.
Just 7 weeks later, his campaign ended in defeat at the Battle of Tolentino. With the British and Austrians closing in, Murat became a hunted fugitive. He sailed to France, but Napoleon had not forgiven his betrayal and refused to see him.
Wow.
After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, he fled to Corsica, gathered a small band of volunteers, and returned to Italy in a hopelessly doomed attempt to start a revolution.
See, once again, as I said earlier, I really like that this series shows you the personality and the background of each of these figures, and sometimes they just do things and you think, yep, that is very much in line with their personality. And this is that from Murat. We've talked about how ambitious he was, how he wanted to hold on to his position more than anything else. Even at this point, it's hopeless, it's done. He's, been forced from his throne, he's gone back to France, Napoleon's not interested, and yet he can't help himself. He has to continue the struggle. He has to believe that he can still succeed, despite everything. That is very much in Murat's character.
And reclaim his throne. Chased by a mob and arrested on the beach, Murat was sentenced to death by the restored Bourbon monarchy of Naples.
Yeah.
He met his end with his usual courage.
Of course.
Telling the firing squad, "If you wish to spare me, aim at the heart." Then gave the order to fire himself.
Typical.
Murat is rightly remembered as one of the great battlefield cavalry commanders of history. Inspirational, fearless, with brilliant tactical instinct. But outside of combat, he was, in Napoleon's estimation, a very poor general.
Wow.
He always waged war without maps. Worse, when the conflict turned against France, he allowed self-interest and vanity to prevail over loyalty to the emperor. As Napoleon's chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, once told him, "You're only a king by the grace of Napoleon and French blood. It's black ingratitude that's blinding you."
It seems like Murat was a man of excess, and some of his best qualities, like his ambition, were also his worst qualities once they went too far. Though I do wonder, and I ask you guys about this, I think in every episode, about the ranking Of course, Murat is a very famous figure, and he achieved a lot. So I do wonder, some of you who are, Napoleonic history buffs, if you feel that this ranking is fair, or you feel that he should be higher up on the list, or maybe lower. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear if y'all have any opinions on that. For me, their description sounds pretty fair, but I do know that regardless of his position on this list, he's definitely one of the most interesting figures of the bunch. Very flamboyant, just, a figure with a very entertaining history. All the stuff he did, all his accomplishments, everywhere he went. So yeah, he's a fascinating guy.
Saint-Cyr, Oudinot, Victor, Murat. 17 down, 9 to go. Join us for part 4, when we'll continue the countdown. Coming soon.
Alrighty. Yeah, that was a great part. As always, I really enjoy this series. It's fantastic. I'm seeing we've got parts 4, 5, and 6, so 3 more parts left. We've got still half the series left. As I mentioned, we are slowing down the further on we get, but I like that we got a little more time for each marshal in this one. We'll get even more time in the future episodes. So yeah, this was a really good one. I really enjoyed looking at all these different characters. I feel like in this series as a whole, and in particular in this one, we really got a good look at the personality of each man, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy looking at individuals and people in history, learning their stories, how their background and their personality influenced what they did. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. And I will see you guys again next time. Hope y'all are having a good day. Goodbye.